VikingAge.com. My name is Chris Schad. I write for the Viking Age as well as zone coverage and bring me the news as well as the Brookings Register. We do this every Monday and Thursday right here on the Viking Age YouTube channel. And we're also available in podcast form on Apple and Spotify the very next day. But however you consume us, please rate, comment, like, and subscribe so we can spread the word and you never miss a new episode. Today's guest on the show, he's written all over the Vikings Twitterverse, or I guess it's the X verse or whatever hellscape it's called now. He has written for Vikings Territory, Zone Coverage, The Athletic, and Pro Football Network. And he has recently launched the Wide Left Substack, which you can follow at wideleftpost.substack.com. And his name is Arif Hasan. And Arif, I'm going to let you talk in just a second, but we have a very important topic to discuss here. You know, will the Vikings trade for Trey Lance? He's become available. He's out there right now. And wait, what am I hearing? He's been traded. But yeah, sure. Great to have you on the show, Arif. No problems. No problems.
I'm happy that the Vikings decided not to be in on the Trey Lance sweepstakes, I guess, as it were. But you know, it would have been pretty entertaining had the Vikings decided to make a move for him too. I think I would have lived with either world.
I think too. I mean, the whole thing was funny on my end because for those who don't follow me on X, the zone coverage account, which does a great job, by the way. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. Arif, they posted this tweet that said, hey, should the Vikings trade for Trey Lance? The only problem was it was Monday, like 72 hours after he had been traded to the Dallas Cowboys. And Arif said something like, bad news. And then everybody jumped on it and was starting liking it. And I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? And I was also working on newspaper stuff. And I felt like everybody was laughing and I looked down and I was in my underwear and then I woke up and the tweet was still up and I was like, I don't know what to do. So, but yeah, that's why you're here because I was like, hey, since this got screwed up, you want to come on the podcast and shoot some Vikings takes? And here we are.
Yeah, no, it was a good opportunity. For people that are unfamiliar with how a lot of this works, very often people will schedule these tweets in advance to remind people, that we've got this article up. If you missed it, you're following our socials. It's very easy to miss stuff, especially in kind of the current Twitterverse. And so we've got all these articles. We automatically put them in and then we automatically schedule them. It's very set it and forget it. But in developing situations like that, it can get out of hand. So yeah, I thought I'd have a little fun. Obviously, no hard feelings or anything like that. I don't think it's a sign of bad journalism or anything like that. But it's just, hey, these things happen. It's kind of funny.
And I think the best part about it is that, I think Trey Lance became a powder keg and as far as Viking fans go, because a whole bunch of people jumped on that tweet. And there's this section of Vikings fans that are, if you suggest anything that they should do at the quarterback position, it instantly becomes into a slight on Kirk Cousins' life. I see Bart Starr's back from the dead. I think the Vikings should take a look at him. Don't you ever threaten Kirk Cousins. And if you ever threaten him again and his handlebar mustache, I will come, I will find you, and I will kill you. That's basically how this thing works.
Yeah, it's always anytime you talk about the quarterback. And the thing is, you could be very complimentary of Kirk Cousins. You could say, hey, I think he's going to have an excellent year. In fact, I think he's going to be so good, he's going to win the MVP. But the problem is that there are just realities on the ground you have to deal with, not just his age, but the fact that his contract is up, right? And so if the Vikings traded for Trey Lance, this would obviously be kind of a long-term move. Maybe they pair that with a draft pick and have Jaron Hall, Trey Lance, and a draft pick compete to start the next year. That would obviously be what's happening. It's not necessarily a dig on Cousins, but anytime you have a discussion about, what might happen at the quarterback position, a lot of people are very quick to defend Cousins. Or even if you talk about, ways the Vikings could extend Cousins, people on the other side of that coin are very willing to just be like, why are you accepting mediocrity? What are you doing here? And it's tough to have these conversations, but I mean, I guess that's why they're fans, right? It's your passion.
Exactly. If they didn't act that way, the Vikings would just be another football team that has wildly entertaining games for good or for bad. Well, we are expecting them to do the same in 2023. And now we know who will be on the team. when they do take the field on September 10th against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The 53-man roster was released yesterday. I'm not going to read the roster verbatim because it would just sound like I'm reading a phone book on the air. But Arif also wrote 3,000 words on the roster over at the Wide Left Substack. So I'm just going to dive right into it right now, even though we have a couple of moves to talk about that have happened in the last 24 hours. But what was your biggest surprise when it came to the 53-man roster, either right now or when it dropped yesterday?
Yeah, I think that if you take a look at the way people projected the roster across, the Vikings media, universe, I think that you could probably say that Nick Muse was one of the surprises. Personally, I didn't find it that surprising. I had always kind of projected that they would have 4 tight ends because I thought the Vikings were genuine in wanting to put forth, 12 personnel much more often, to have a 2 tight end offense, to be heavier in a lot of situations, to have that fullback in there, to have 3 big bodies in addition to the offensive line. It didn't surprise me, but it was something that I think a lot of people were surprised by. And I think the clue actually should have been in that third preseason game. Muse played only I think the first 2 drives or something like that. He was out of the game pretty quickly, right? And so you got Ben Sims, who unfortunately, he was claimed off of waivers. He was a guy that I wanted on the practice squad. But Ben Simmons and Colin Thompson playing most of the game at tight end. So a surprise to a lot of people, probably the biggest surprise there. I know that Jaron Hall was only in about half of roster projections, again, because of the third quarterback rule. I thought, he was a shoo-in to make it. And after that third preseason game, Kevin O'Connell basically said, hey, third quarterback rule, we love Jaron Hall as our third quarterback. Like him just outright saying that Hall was going to make the roster, especially after a game like that where he was just spectacular. That made a lot of sense. Najee Thompson, same thing. I put him on my 53. Many people did not. I think that kind of came as a surprise, especially surprising because initial reporting was that he was cut and he wasn't.
Yeah. Speaking of Twitter miscues, yes, but
Yeah. So that kind of again, that just is kind of the stuff that happens. Maybe for me personally, the biggest surprise that Luigi Villain did not make the roster, with Andre Carter making it ahead of him, despite Villain having, in my opinion, a far better preseason and, from my understanding, a much better camp. And I kind of dove into it a little bit, and I was like, well, what's kind of the upside situation for a lot of these guys? And height tends to matter a lot at edge rusher. That's why you don't see a lot of 6 foot tall edge rushers. And Villain is 6'2", and Andre Carter is 6'5". But they're the same weight. Villain actually has slightly longer arms, slightly shorter wingspan, but slightly longer arms. And actually had just marginally better testing, a little bit faster in the 40, a little bit faster in the 10 split. Actually quite a bit better in the explosives, and I believe a little bit slower in the agilities, but largely the same. So from an upside perspective, I didn't actually think that there was a huge difference between the two, but Andre Carter was so productive at Army, so productive, that he was considered a top 100 player by many people. He was given the highest undrafted free agent salary, as well as the highest guaranteed money among undrafted free agents. So I think in this case, the Vikings were trying to avoid a Ben Sims situation, right? Where they didn't want, they wanted to keep both of them. They knew they could only keep one on the official roster and only one on the practice squad. They probably figured that Carter was more likely to get claimed off of waivers than Villain. And, that's, Villain did not get claimed. So, they made the gamble correctly there. So I think that probably played a role there, but I do think that Villain is the better player. We'll see kind of what game day activations look like and stuff like that. But I think that was probably personally the biggest surprise to me. And then Joanne Williams not making it, I thought was also a bit of a surprise. I knew that he was not 100% to make the roster, but that I think I personally would have put him on the roster, but I'm a little bit too quick to cut some guys that don't develop quickly enough. Maybe I don't have enough patience, but for me, Andrew Booth was kind of a no-go. I understand why they kept him, but it's when you've only got 5 cornerbacks and one of them is not really a cornerback, it's tough to find room for some of these guys. And he made the practice squad, by the way, because you can have like 6 vets there. So
yeah, the two that kind of stood out to me, you kind of mentioned them, but I'll go through them just quickly from my standpoint. Andre Carter making it at edge rusher, that was a little bit of a surprise, but it almost wasn't, because I think you look at the undrafted bonus, which it's $100,000. I mean, the NFL salary cap is well over 200 million right now, I believe.
mm-hmm.
So, I mean, really it's chump change when you look at it, but he's 6'5". He's got that size you were talking about, and he had insane production at Army. Looking at him as a prospect, I know there was some first round buzz about this time a year ago about Andre Carter. or maybe
Actually, yeah, no, there was actually that
yeah.
first round buzz lasted all the way, I think, into January,
Well, and I
and then
think
he just
too,
started because I was tracking that, and he started falling. Yeah,
yeah, and he had that weird situation where I think they had a bill where you couldn't forego your service because if he goes to army, he has to actually serve in the army for like 2 years, I think it is. And there was some scuttlebutt about, hey, you have to serve before you can play the NFL, and everybody's like, he's going to be a first round pick. Like, we need to do something about this. And then he wound up being undrafted mainly because he didn't have the upper body strength that you want in an edge rusher. I think he was, if you go on mock draftable, I think he was in the 0 percentile. So like he was the absolute
he's
bottom.
something like 11 reps or something like that on the bench, which is like that's cornerback type numbers. That's
Right.
surprising to me. Yeah,
Yeah. I think he's a guy that you need to keep on the roster for a year. You need to develop, you need to kind of cultivate him and let him kind of try and flourish. And in a year, if he's not good to your standards, you just let him go. But like you said, you can't let him go on the practice squad after giving him that bonus. And then, having another team scoop him up, develop him, and then cash in on your mistake.
yeah, exactly. And the reason that like the signing bonus thing kind of matters is not because the actual money matters, right? Because I think most signing bonuses for undrafted free agents are like $25,000. His was $300,000, right? It's the biggest. And the reason that matters is not because the Vikings are unwilling to eat a $300,000 cap hit. Like I mean, I think they ate that with Joanne Williams, right? Like
Yeah.
it's obviously there's something that they're comfortable with, but it's an indication that his market was so good that other teams wanted him, right? And so there was a really good chance that, especially at a high value position like the edge, that another team was going to take. So he had negotiated a market well enough to be coveted among any other team. And like you said, the service academy stuff, that's always really difficult. The Patriots dealt with that with Joe Cardona, the long snapper, Diego Fagot, the linebacker. The Vikings dealt with that. The Air Force with that long snapper, Austin Cutting.
Yes.
And I know that was a long-term question for was it Jalen Robinette from Air Force a while back? Like these things kind of keep happening. I know that Navy had a quarterback / running back that there were some questions about, and the rules keep changing. Not just across administrations, but within administrations. Like so, there was one rule. Trump changed the rule. Then Trump changed the rule again. And then in the Biden administration, I believe it was an act of Congress this time as opposed to an executive order that changed the rule once more. And it's very confusing for NFL teams. It's obviously very confusing for these players, right, that are in the spot where they just don't know what their future is going to look like. And the definition of what counts as service changes too. Like I know that Austin Cutting, for example, he was required right after graduation to do 2 years of service, but he had negotiated with the Air Force that service would be essentially reserve / recruiting. And so he could fulfill that service with the Vikings. But again, these definitely, and so that kind of uncertainty plus, concerns about, upper body strength, concerns about, overall, I mean, like he just did not have very good agility scores. Those kinds of concerns kind of are a reason that somebody might peter out of the draft. But as soon as you get confirmation from the agent that like, this is something that he might be able to actually do, given whatever the legal framework for this is at the time, then he became a very coveted free agent. Kind of not super similar to the Lyle Collins situation, but because Lyle Collins fell out of the draft, he was considered a top 15 pick. And he was considered a person of interest in a murder investigation. He turns out he had nothing to do with it. And there was just this news broke the day before the draft, right? And so teams just didn't know what to do. So he fell out. And then after the second round, he was like, look, the contract for undrafted free agents is 3 years. The contract for drafted players is 4 years. I'm going to make more money if I'm an undrafted free agent. I'm going to make it sooner. So, and I get to pick my team. So don't draft me. I'm not going to show up to camp if you draft me. So he goes undrafted and he earns the highest era adjusted signing bonus in undrafted free agent history. So it's somewhat similar in that the uncertainty kind of drove a player that probably would have been drafted, but interestingly, his play in camp and his play in the preseason didn't really live up to that hype. Not that that's a huge problem as like a rookie, but like, it's something to kind of consider.
The other interesting move as far as players that made the roster goes, Nick Muse as well. The Vikings have a pretty deep tight end room with TJ Hawkinson, Josh Oliver, and the world's best number 3 tight end, Johnny Munt. I think it would be quite the battle actually to have Johnny Munt go against the world's greatest nose tackle, Shamar Stephen, but that's another conversation for another day. I'm wondering what this move signals because, as you mentioned, the Vikings have not been shy where they want to play a more physical brand of football this year. Whereas, I would liken it. I'm going to go into my kind of toy department right now and like make a pro wrestling reference because, like, in a wrestling match, you have the heel and the face. The face, who is the good guy or the baby face for long, he spends half the match just getting wailed on, and the heel walks around, struts his stuff, and like gets the crowd to boo him and stuff. But then the face at the end of the match, hulks up like Hulk Hogan would, and then he'd hit his big move, and then he'd wind up winning the match, and everybody would go home happy. That was basically how the Vikings were last year with all of those fourth quarter comebacks where they would just get wailed on, and then they would wind up, pulling it out at the end. This year, I think the Vikings want to be that heel. They want to be the guy that comes out, just starts wailing on people and wear them down. So by the end of the game, they can take advantage. That means more 12 personnel. That might mean a little bit of 13 personnel if they want to get creative. There are going to be a lot heavier sets this year. But you also can't ignore what's going on with TJ Hawkinson and the possibility that maybe they kept Nick Muse because TJ Hawkinson's going to come down with scurvy next week before the opener or something. Like, it's the elephant in the room. And I'm kind of wondering, what do you think this signals more? Do the Vikings want to go heavy, or are they really worried about this Hawkinson thing?
Yeah, I think that this is really about making sure that they've got enough tight ends, that they're heavy in their approach and all that. I think this TJ Hawkinson stuff, like, it's certainly a cause for concern. I think it's probably going to get resolved a little bit faster than a lot of people say. I think that when teams leak stuff like, and I don't know technically who leaked it, but I suspect it was the Vikings, leak stuff like, he's trying to reset the tight end market. It's essentially manipulating the public or negotiating in public that like his demands don't make sense or whatever, and that they have to come closer to the Vikings. When they do stuff like that, we're at basically kind of the end point of negotiations. They go public at the end, right? They don't start their negotiations in public unless it's like a weird situation like with Lamar Jackson, right? So like that's, one of those scenarios where it's like they're probably close to, do or die on some of the key figures in the contract. And I think it'll probably get resolved. The Vikings have been extremely stingy about some of this stuff, while at the same time handing out big money to players that are mostly unknowns. Josh Oliver's only had one good season. Byron Murphy is coming off of an injury. Marcus Davenport is coming off of a really bad season, right? Players that for whatever reason are undervalued by the market, but they're still throwing a lot of money at it. And you've got TJ Hawkinson, who's produced for 4 years, instantly produced as soon as he showed up at the Vikings, despite not knowing the playbook. And it feels a little bit disrespectful. So I can see why, Hawkinson would be kind of upset, or Hawkinson's agent at least would be a little bit upset. But I think the Vikings are very methodical in their approach to this sort of thing. They certainly have enough cap space this year and next year to kind of figure out a long-term deal, especially if they get the Jefferson stuff done before the season, which it sounds like they want to.
And I was talking to somebody the other day about the Hawkinson thing, and they're like, I don't understand why he wants to reset the market. I think this is kind of just a strategic thing where, the first rule of negotiation is to ask for more than you actually want, right? And if they come back a little bit down, you kind of go, okay, yeah, whatever. The reason he wants to reset this market is not only is he probably the best tight end that is eligible for a contract extension right now, next year, if they slap the franchise tag and kick this thing down another week, they will. Sorry, I just got a text from somebody as I'm like trying to finish my thought.
Yeah.
But if they kick this down the road, George Kittle might need a new extension because he doesn't have any more guaranteed money on his contract. And Travis Kelce might get another deal that ensures he retires a Chief because he also does not have money on his contract. So, I mean, this is maybe like a window, like, hey, let's try and get through this window, see what it is. And if we can't get it, let's get something close to that. Because I think you're right when you do say, hey, teams only link stuff at the end. They don't come out and be like, our opening offer to TJ Hawkinson was 4 years, 64 million. And what? No, it doesn't work that way. So I do think maybe it comes to an end. I think it's very valid for people to kind of be like, I don't know if this is going to get done because Wasey has yet to hand out a long-term extension so far.
Yeah, and it's important to like put the market in that context. That's a really good point. So if you take a look at Kittle and Kelsey, and we can throw Mark Andrews in there as well. There are three of the top five, I want to say, in average money. They all signed their contracts in 2020 or their extensions, right? So all three of them have deals that come out of 2020. Well, the cap has increased substantially since then, as
Yeah.
it does every year, right? And so what they earned in 2020 is not what they would earn on the open market now in 2023. And so Hawkinson might, end up in a situation where he gets more per year than someone like Kelsey or Kittle, which is around, I want to say 15 million, but it would occupy less space against the cap than they did when they signed. And so you can set the market without commanding the kind of attention from a salary cap perspective that those tight ends did. Now, the one exception to like the guys who are at the top end of tight end money, Darren Waller, who just signed an extension with the New York Giants. He did it in 2023 for 17.5 million. He's the highest paid tight end in average annual salary. I think also in terms of like first 3 year cash flow, which is the thing that really matters, he might also be at the top there. But the largest deal was signed by Kittle, but as you pointed out, a lot of that's unguaranteed. And so the Vikings can actually. So if Hawkinson is like really set on this idea of like setting the tight end market, there's a lot of ways you could do that. You could do that in terms of signing bonus. You could do that in terms of total money. You could do it in terms of total guaranteed money, or you could do it in terms of average per year. A lot of ways that you can do it. And the Vikings could, in theory, offer Hawkinson a fair deal that also happens to give him the most total money in a contract that a tight end has ever signed. But the final 3 years of that deal might not be guaranteed. They might explode. There might be void years at the end that alleviate the cap, but give him signing bonus money immediately. Stuff like that. So I don't think they're in like a place where it is difficult for them to do something like quote unquote reset the tight end market without, they don't have to hurt themselves at the same time. So contract negotiations are always really difficult to break down, especially as you get into the minutia like this. But I do think that, the Vikings see a lot of value in Hawkinson. The way that Jefferson's production changed after Hawkinson arrived, I think his yards per game was relatively similar, but it was his passes came deeper downfield. His average depth of target increased whenever Hawkinson was on the field, which we didn't see that effect with Adam Thielen or KJ Osborne. Hawkinson was taking coverage away from the top, and so they were able to run Jefferson over the top and target him. So they were able to get him bigger plays that mattered more. And they know that, they value that. And so I think that they don't want to undercut themselves when it comes to some of these other players that might be up for an extension. Like, what if Marcus Davenport has a great year? Oh no. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Now you have to extend him, right? He's a 1-year contract. So like, obviously that's not really a worst case scenario, but it's one you have to consider. Right. And so they want to protect themselves in that situation. They have no idea what's going to happen on the quarterback market for themselves. They've got tons of players hitting free agency next year, in part because of all these 1-year contracts, but also a lot of players have their deals expiring. Players like, I think Danielle Hunter only signed it for this year, right? Like I don't think he's got a long-term deal with the Vikings. So you got to deal with all of this stuff. They've got so many players hitting free agency. So they have to balance all of that out and make sure that their cap hit is managed next year and the year after.
Yes, and that cap is going to play a big role, not only down the line, but right now, as the Vikings are still making moves. They're still adding guys. They signed Myles Gaskin this morning. They also signed David Quessenberry, who was cut by the Buffalo Bills. I was just kind of looking at some of the headlines over there, and one of them actually says Vikings address offensive line problem by signing Quessenberry. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's start. Well, yeah, let's start talking about it now. What do you think is the biggest weakness with this team heading into the season? Like for me, it's offensive line, but what do you think?
It really kind of depends on the secondary, right? Like I think because it's so many unproven players, right? Caleb Evans only played a couple of games. Kai Blackman is a rookie. Byron Murphy again, he's coming off of an injury. He looked great, absolutely great in camp, but he's also had about a year and a half of high level production. He wasn't this astounding corner coming out of the draft or as a rookie or as a second year player. And so I think that there is a legitimate concern to say there's just a lot of unknowns in that secondary, and they don't really have the depth to handle injuries, right? Because the only depth corner you have right now is Andrew Booth, who is the most injured player in the history of the world, right? Like it's so tough to like become.
He's been injured since high school.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, it's so tough to be comfortable with like the way that that cornerback room is shaking out. So even if you're confident that Mekhi Blackman has this great ceiling as a nickel corner, if you're really confident that Byron Murphy is going to play to the level of his contract, if you're confident that a Caleb Evans can live up to those flashes, even with all of that, even if you give like them all of the positives on these coin flips, there's still concern about injury. There's still concern about, mismatches in size. Like the Vikings, like a Caleb Evans is the tall corner, right? They don't like if they're up against like a Cincinnati Bengals that have more than one tall. What do they do? Do they throw Andrew Booth out there? Right? Like that's a really difficult situation. So the offensive line is certainly a concern. That interior, I wonder about it. Ed Ingram needs to make big improvements. He did in that first preseason game, which was nice. One mistake, but otherwise played really well. But you just don't know there. And so I get it. I totally understand. I think the offensive line is up there, but the two elite tackles, plus, in theory, Garrett Bradbury's increased level of play from last year, maybe that translates going forward. There's something there that's at least steady that'll allow you, some options, whether it forces you to roll out and, depend a lot on those tackles to defend you on those bootlegs or whatever. There's something there with that secondary. If it doesn't live up to expectations, if two of those three players are just not starting quality, which is entirely in the cards, you're going to get roasted every game.
You look at everybody in that secondary and they all have injury concerns, right? Like especially at cornerback. It's like, Byron Murphy missed a year and a half, that's not great. Caleb Evans has 3 concussions. Also not good. Andrew Booth, I made the joke that he might as well just like said during his introductory press conference, I just got done burying a body in the back, because that's about as alarming as I've been injured since high school. Juwan Williams, even if he made the team, he missed all of last year with an injury. Like there are so many questions there. I think the offensive line has been thrown to the forefront, especially since the quarterback documentary came out, because I think a lot of people wound up seeing like how bad it got for Kirk Cousins, like getting his ribs bashed in on a weekly basis, and have Ezra Cleveland walk over and say, "Oh, sorry, Kirk, here you go." Like, I wonder, and one of the things that's nice about Kirk is that he's there to play every game. He shows up, whether he needs to get stretched or whatever. I mean, durability is not a question mark with Kirk Cousins, but you also can't take that for granted. And I mean, they're returning all 5 starters across the offensive line. That's good. But it's really only a name, because 2 of them allowed the most pressures in the NFL a year ago. Then you have some depth problem. Oli Udoh did Oli Udoh stuff during the preseason, giving up those sacks. And then Quesenberry, or I'm still trying to get the name in my head because I didn't put it on the outline because it happened just before we recorded here. But I mean, Quesenberry, I am not going to get excited that the offensive line is fixed because they went and they signed a guy that somebody else cut. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, they could come out, they could look a lot better, but week 1, we're going to find out a lot of stuff, because Vita Vea is standing right across from that interior to the offensive line. And, if Kirk's going to get his ribs hurt, I would prefer it not have it happen in week 1, but I guess we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, huge issue, right? He was the most hit quarterback in the NFL last year, something that I think the documentary explicitly stated, but also you check all the stats. It is true, right?
Yeah.
It's difficult because Quesenberry is almost certainly just a depth guy for probably while Chris Reed is out. And then my guess is that Quesenberry is probably going to get moved off the roster when Chris Reed comes off of PUP. That's my guess. So I don't think that this is like a huge move, but like you said, he was cut off of an offensive line. He was cut off another team, and it wasn't like a team that is chock full of depth along the offensive line either. Not many teams are, right? Like basically, if someone's cut from the Eagles, you can just be like, yeah, actually, maybe this guy might work out. Like that's fair, right? But all of these other teams, you're just like, I don't know.
Yeah.
um, Quesenberry has been all right in the limited play that he's had in the regular season. He was originally drafted by the Texans. I think they cut him. He played on the Titans for a year, and then he was with the Bills in and out. I don't think that he's played like the last 3 or 4 years. I don't think he's played over 100 snaps in a single season. So it's not as if he's ever demonstrated starting talent, but he's not been that bad compared to, say, Oli Udoh at guard, right? So in that sense, it's an upgrade, but it's not somebody that, like, if Ed Ingram it just continues to struggle. Let's say that preseason stuff was whatever. It was only like 15 snaps, right? If that was whatever, right, and he continues to struggle, it's not as if you can say, hey, we've got this guy that's going to be able to replace him. Like, no, you're in a really tough spot. So that's obviously a pretty big concern. And then Ezra Cleveland, of course, he's been up and down. I actually tend to think of him as kind of an above average NFL guard, but you're right that pressure total is really alarming, and you hope that doesn't continue. Like this, I would consider a down year for him after having moved to the left side again from the right side earlier. Um, I don't know that the Vikings can have a solution if they find out that, like, continuity is not the answer. Like you can't just solve your offensive line issues by being continuous, right? It's the same guys that caused the problem last year. That said, Kirk Cousins is known for holding onto the ball a fair amount. It's probably a reason that they didn't do that much play action relative to his career, because you hold on to the ball longer in play action, the pressure arrives and you might get hit a little bit more often. And he was already seeing enough of that. So all of that probably kind of plays a role in how a lot of the season played out, but certainly doesn't feel like the Vikings were aggressive about making sure that they could fix that offensive line, which, by the way, I think one of the free agents that I mentioned next year, I think one of them is Ezra Cleveland. So
Yes.
they could somewhat easily, maybe next year draft a guard in the second round or something like that, and maybe just kind of move on. But you might be stuck with that Ingram for a while. They might have been tricked by Garrett Bradbury. Maybe that was a fluke year, right? So it's kind of difficult to navigate that, but they wanted to make sure. I mean, they didn't have a ton of draft picks. They wanted to make sure that they had a replacement for Adam Thielen. They had some answers on the defense and rotated through that cornerback group. So you can't fix every problem.
And I think one of the places where they thought they had an answer was at the running back position as well. I know that you are a member of the analytic community. So, running backs, you want to pay them cheap, you want to use them up, and you want to go on to the next one. It's why 3 kickers were traded for yesterday, and nobody traded for Jonathan Taylor. Although the Packers were involved, which pretty much makes them the Minnesota Twins of the NFL because they're in on everybody. They never make a move. So that's always fun. Let's talk about the running backs because Alexander Mattison, they go out last year. He has a career low in carries behind Dalvin Cook. He hits free agency. Everybody thinks he's gone. And then he re-signs at a cheap deal. They draft Dwayne McBride in the 7th round, but you can draft a 7th round running back, but they all can't be Isaiah Pacheco. Oh, Isaiah Pacheco. Oh, like 7th round, so cheap. He plays with Mahomes. And then you have Myles Gaskin coming in on Tuesday morning. They might be fine in the backfield, but coming into the season, I need to see this group perform because I have a lot of questions. How about you?
I think it's fair. I mean, Madison has, over the course of his career, played all right. The past 2 years, I have not been as encouraging. His skill in avoiding negative plays, that I'm not going to say it evaporated or anything last year, but it wasn't as present as we're used to seeing. But like you said, he had a career low in carries. And so, maybe that's just a sample size issue. But if that's gone, then he doesn't really have a ton to offer, right? I mean, he is a decent pass protector when he knows his assignment, which over the last 2 years, he's done a better job kind of figuring out what he needs to do in pass protection. And he's actually a very capable receiver. He's got very good hands. But as a runner, there's not much because he doesn't create explosive plays. He just doesn't, right? Like if you get a 17-yard run out of him, he might be tapped out, right?
Yeah.
in other ways, he's ridiculously athletic. Like he's very good at hurdling people. His jump cuts are magnificent. Like he's a very good athlete in some senses, but he just doesn't have breakaway speed. And so if you don't have his ability to avoid negatives, you don't have a lot. Adrian Peterson made up for the negatives with the huge positives, and Dalvin Cook kind of similar. Um, that is going to have to be part of his role, is making sure that they grind out at least 2 yards in every possible carry, and then anything more than that is going to be a bonus, right? It's going to be something that he gets with the strength in his vision and his explosiveness, right? So like that's something that you hope to see, but we haven't seen over the past 2 years, and so that's a little bit of a question mark. Ty Chandler, I like him a lot. I thought that he showcased some really excellent. I mean, his statistics in the preseason were not good, but I thought on film, you take that out of it, I thought he showcased some excellent stuff. I mean, he was getting harassed in the backfield when the backup and backup offensive lines were just folding. And he did a pretty good job avoiding tackles. I think that when the blocking was there, he did a pretty good job finding the space that was necessary for him. But again, it's kind of an unknown. He was a receiving back basically at UNC, even though he's got the size to be a 3-down guy. Can he be a running back? Kenny Nwangwu, injured for most of training camp, doesn't have a ton of running back experience. I don't like what I see on film from him in terms of running back vision, in terms of his balance. I think that he's mostly a speed guy that needs to process faster in order to be an effective running back. So I don't know. So getting Myles Gaskin in there, I think, helps resolve a lot of those concerns because he's a proven producer. He led the Dolphins in rushing yards last year. He had a really good preseason this year. He's somebody that is genuinely a very capable back. And that might be all you need in order for that like running back core, that committee, to feel a little bit more solid, because I felt like there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of upside, tons of upside, but a lot of uncertainty about what that running back group would be. And now I think that you've got maybe a floor in terms of production because Gaskin has explosiveness. He's got the ability to kind of read the blocks in front of him. He's got pass catching capability. There's a lot more there than hoping that Ty Chandler can actually run between the tackles. He's got the size for it, but he didn't do it a lot at UNC. Or hoping that Kenny Nwangwu has got the ability to kind of read what's happening, or hoping that Madison can actually find those chunk plays. Like that's tough. Gaskin at least offers that certainty.
And I think there's the added bonus with Gaskin that he's not exactly, I mean, hardcore fantasy football players will know who he is, but I mean, guys like, they brought in Kareem Hunt, right? I mean, if I'm Alexander Madison and all of a sudden, the Vikings are giving $4 million to Kareem Hunt, oh, don't worry, he's a former NFL rushing champion, but he's just going to be your backup. Like, it'd be like, excuse me? Like,
yeah, right.
There would be some questions there for me. I think the Vikings backfield will be a success if they just get consistent gains. And I think that's their goal after having Dalvin Cook run to the back of the offensive line, where it was the Adrian Peterson thing, 0, 1, 0, -2, whatever, 70. Yeah, they don't want that.
Right.
They want more like, 4, 6, open up the playbook a little bit and have Kevin O'Connell, be able to utilize one of the strengths on this team. And as we segue into that, I think one of the best strengths is at wide receiver because you have Justin Jefferson, obviously the best receiver in the NFL. KJ Osborne, Jordan Addison looks pretty good if he can stay healthy. Jalen Naylor, they like him a lot. And Brandon Powell's preseason was very good. I think he's the reason Jalen Reagor got waived this morning because he can function as a receiver, he can return kicks, and he can return punts. And if Kenny Nwangwu is going on IR, you need somebody to do both. And I think that Powell definitely was one of the guys who won a spot and definitely solidified this wide receiver group coming into the year.
Yeah, it's one of the best receiver groups that you could, in theory, hope to have. I think last year a lot of people expected it to be a high-level receiving group, and we didn't see that. We didn't see an additional next step for Osborne. We didn't see, Adam Thielen had begun his decline, which, by the way, if you watch Thielen in the preseason, it very much feels like it might be over for him. So I think the Vikings
to unite us with the Chargers type, or no, who was on the Chargers? Joe Namath with the Chargers?
Oh boy, was Joe? Yeah, maybe. I mean,
immaculate
Joe Namath
grid points right there, guys. But
had so many injuries at the end of his career. I just believe anything for Namath. But
yeah,
I don't know. Thielen looks like he's done, and I think we'd seen a little bit of that decline last year. And so if Addison is going to be maybe 80-90% of what Thielen was at his peak, I think that the Vikings could return to maybe having that strength. And if they don't, if Addison is just a pretty good rookie, maybe like a 700-800 yard guy, um, then they still have like a very diverse and deep group, right? With KJ Osborne and, like you mentioned, Brandon Powell, who looked good basically every single day in, day out of camp, and then also had a pretty good preseason and also motivated, like you mentioned, or not motivated, but allowed the Vikings to just kind of move on from Jalen Reagor when they needed to make some space for Myles Gaskin.
Mhm.
And then there's Jalen Naylor, who played very well in spring, before pads come on, before there's contact, early in training camp, and then that injury that it feels like it's always close to being resolved, and then it isn't. So I don't know what's going on there. But having Naylor available to you, as a speed guy that might be able to stretch the field and add another dimension, it's a great, you know, landscape at receiver. Again, it's one where, okay, you've got Justin Jefferson. He could go for 1,800 yards again. You're very comfortable calling him the best receiver in the NFL. Fine. You're always going to have a good receiver group if you got the best receiver in the NFL. But beyond that, kind of what it can provide, there's some question marks. But I think for the most part, I think people are pretty happy with it, and they've got a reason to be. I think Addison has demonstrated some really high level stuff, and I would bet on him, right, to exceed the average expectation for a rookie first round receiver. I think that he looks more impressive than that. So I like it, but we do have to acknowledge, like, there are question marks.
One of the other positions that I like going into the year is at safety. And you kind of asked some questions about the secondary, but I like the depth they have at safety right now, because I think Brian Flores, they're listed as safeties, but I think we're going to see them as linebackers a lot. Harrison Smith obviously comes back. He's a little long in the tooth, but he can still get the job done. It'll be interesting to see how much they have him rush the passer. Cameron Bynum, I think a lot of people kind of expected Lewis Seen to pass him this offseason and take that starting job. But I mean, Bynum's intelligence has definitely been a strength and kept him in the starting lineup. You have Josh Metellus, who is rumored to have that Joker role. Lewis Seen's obviously there. They're still trying to develop him. And then you have Theo Jackson and Jay Ward. I think at the very least, you at least have a lot of physical players that give you some strength in numbers. And if somebody does get banged up, you got somebody to throw in there. I know safety is kind of one of the least valuable positions as far as analytics go, but I like what they're doing here.
Yeah, and honestly, kind of the question of how valuable safety is actually something that's been bounced around in a bunch of different directions in the analytics community. So it is possible that they're actually a quite high value position that NFL teams underdevelop or undervalue, right? Because safety is one of those positions where if you were better at some of the key skills at safety, they'd just move you to corner and play corner instead because it's a higher value position. So you don't tend to always get, the highest talent players in college coming out and playing that position. So it is tough. That said, the safety room is very interesting. Like you mentioned, it's a very big room. We've got 6 players in it. That's not something that you expect. I imagine at some point, if they need to make additional room, right? If Chris Reed comes back, maybe they don't cut David Questenberry, maybe they cut Theo Jackson, right? It's going to be an area where you could see opportunities to kind of cut the fat if you need to make another roster move. But for now, they thought that they just had too much talent, right? So Harrison Smith, Cameron Bynum, everyone expect them to start, like you mentioned. These other safety roles are often kind of really other positions, whether it's Jay Ward playing nickel corner as well as safety, whether it's Josh Metellus playing kind of linebacker in dime or big 3 nickel type roles, or what have you, whatever, right? Like you can envision Harrison Smith dropping into the box and Lewis Seen playing high up in a 3 safety set, right? And Cameron Bynum maybe even playing in the slot. Like it is entirely possible that the safety group is diverse enough to really, get Brian Flores' creative juices flowing, right? Like he has designed a lot of very interesting blitzes over the course of his career, and it's kind of a thing that he's very well known for. And creating these angles in unusual situations that are difficult for offenses to account for, a lot of that can spring from the safety position, and more so than at like other positions like linebacker, right? Like if you have a safety linebacker like Foya Luakun, like who previously played for the Falcons, now he's a Jaguar, they tend to just bulk you up and play linebacker, or they tend to slim you down like Mark Barron and play you back at safety, right? Like they don't
Yeah.
tend to love, what happened with Isaiah Simmons, right? It's just like, all right, he played every position at Arizona. That didn't work out, so he's going to trade him. And then now at his new place, he's just playing the one position. He's playing that, right?
Yeah.
So that's the versatility at linebacker tends to be overstated. Sometimes you get somebody like an Anthony Barr, where you're like, yeah, that guy can play off the edge sometimes. So we're going to play around with that. But the Vikings found more value just having him off the ball persistently and then maybe blitzing. With safety, you could just do all of those things, right? Like when you see what the Chargers do with Derwin James, they do everything with him. They have him play man coverage, slot, outside. They have him man up to tight ends or receivers. They have him play in the box. They have him play up high. He might be the best blitzer regardless of position in the NFL. And so they have him do that a lot. Safety, you can use that versatility a lot more than you can at other positions. And I think Brian Flores really values that, which is one reason that you've got such a big safety room.
Yeah, and I think too, kind of wrapping everything up with the roster and that stuff. I think the safeties are going to do a good job at complementing the linebackers as well. You bring back Jordan Hicks. You have Ivan Pace Jr., who by far and away was Mr. Mankato this year. Brian Asamoah, a lot of people are expecting him to step up. And then you also have Troy Dye, who has been kind of a stalwart on special teams. I don't know what to think about this team. I mean, the linebacker position, it's interesting because you have a lot of guys who kind of look like safeties, which is where you kind of look at how they could be interchanged. But I mean, you could see what Brian Flores wants in a defense. I'm not sure if he has the horses to like jump up into the upper half of the NFL, but I mean, I think like even a 10 spot jump to like 20th, I think would be a huge improvement, especially looking at the roster they have right now.
Mm-hmm. If you take a look at what Brian Flores did when he started at Miami as a head coach the first year, you take a look at that roster. That defensive roster is not good, or it wasn't, right? In what was it 2020? I want to say, um, not a very good roster. You take a look at it, and it's like, oh, you got Xavier Howard, and it's kind of it, right? The defensive line wasn't as built out as it is right now. Look, it's a really good defensive line right now. That cornerback room, even without Jalen Ramsey, that cornerback room has like a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of interesting stuff to it, in part because of like undrafted free agents like Kader Kohu. It's a good unit now in terms of talent, but in 2020 it just wasn't. And they finished like 16th in EPA per play. And that's because Brian Flores is a gifted defensive mind, and he did a really good job finding ways to create pressure from a defensive line that just wasn't very good at creating pressure on its own, finding ways to get the most out of that safety group that they had in Miami, which actually that was kind of talented. And you had some downhill movement, and they were like, hey, these guys are better moving downhill than they are necessarily being center fielders. So we're just going to blitz them and stuff like that. And so he knew how to use the players that he had, and in particular, mask their weaknesses and emphasize their strengths in ways that melded with his defensive philosophy that allowed them to be at least functional on defense. It wasn't a good team, they started, trying to bribe him to tank for a reason. It wasn't a good team, but
Yes.
The defense that he had coordinated, despite the talent of that team, was really, I think, impressive. So you take a look at that. You take a look at the Vikings unit, and you say, "Hey, I'm kind of getting some of the same vibes, especially if half of these, like I mentioned, coin flips earlier. If half of the coin flips don't work out, right? Let's say Mickey Blackman works out and Byron Murphy works out, but Caleb Evans doesn't. Marcus Davenport doesn't, right? So you've got like maybe half of these players aren't really doing the thing that you'd kind of hoped would be kind of your ceilings for them. He's still going to find ways to create production, whether that is, maybe Marcus Davenport just isn't, doesn't have the stamina to play a full game, or he doesn't have the pass rush moves that he had. And it's like, well, I've got Ivan Pace, and he's not good at coverage, but he can blitz. And so we're going to take Marcus Davenport off the field, put DJ Wanham out there. DJ Wanham's a distraction. I'm going to blitz with Ivan Pace, right? He's going to find ways to maximize that roster in ways that I think a lot of other defensive coordinators, especially at Donatel, don't really have the capability of doing. I like you. I don't think that vaults the Vikings into the top 10, and probably not even the top half. But I think it's on the table, right? That they rank better than 20th, despite how they did last year.
Let's wrap up by just kind of looking at things from a macro view. Wait, macro, micro, small, macro. I write for a living, but I'm just trying to.
Don't worry about it. Words not important.
Yes, absolutely not. We're soon we'll all be replaced by AI anyway, and we can just go from there.
You can read about that, by the way, at the Wide Left Post Substack.
That's why I mentioned it. That's a nice little plug, and that's definitely in a roundabout way. But this team, the Vikings, the NFC, the owners, they want to be super competitive again. The NFC North is kind of wide open with Aaron Rodgers going to New York. Philly and San Francisco are in that upper class of the conference. But how close do you think the Vikings are to being in that next tier of contenders and maybe making a run this year?
I mean, it kind of depends on what you mean by making a run. I don't think the Vikings are close to, winning the Super Bowl, but certainly I think the Vikings have enough talent to be a competitive playoff team. Personally, if I'm going to project out all the Vikings outcomes and figure out kind of what the most likely is, I think the Vikings are 9.5 win team. I think that it's possible they're a 10-win team. The fact that the division might be pretty weak, it kind of depends on what Jordan Love does, whether or not the Lions stuff is sustainable. I'm already discounting Chicago. I'm done. I was like, hey, maybe Justin Fields, but now I'm done. Um, that division might make it a little bit easier to grab some wins, but the thing is, so in the aggregate, the Viking schedule is only slightly tougher than average compared to other NFL teams. But when you take a look at the teams that are pretty difficult, they're really difficult. I think you've got both. Like you've got the Eagles coming up in week 2, but you've got the Chiefs down the line. You've got like some teams that like the good teams are up against are just really good, right? And so
Yeah.
that is going to be it's going to be tough. It's going to be hard to like cheat a win off of like the Chiefs, right? Like which I mean, shocker, but like for the Vikings, that's going to be tough. And so it is possible that they get 9.5, 10 wins, something like that. But I think the most likely outcome is something like 9. They can make a run again if those coin flips just kind of go the right way. The areas where they've got uncertainty, I'm pretty confident that that offense is going to score a lot of points. Right? It's not going to be top 3, but there's a possibility it's top 5. Like that is
Yeah.
absolutely a scenario to consider. So if you've got potentially a top 5 offense and like the 20th ranked defense, let's say, right? And we don't have to be completely optimistic about that defense. Let's say it's the 20th ranked defense. Yeah, you've got a playoff spot generally, unless the ball bounces the wrong way. You reverse all the luck that you had last year, right? You're a playoff team. More than that, I don't know. It would be really difficult unless like last year they play another team like themselves. It'd be really difficult to see them winning a playoff game, and certainly I don't think advancing further or deep into the playoffs. So make a run, I don't know, but like I think the playoffs are there. I used to be of kind of the opinion like you just got to make it into the dance. Like I've seen the Ravens do it, I've seen the Giants do it twice. You just got to make the dance. I'm done with that. You got to be good to win.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
like that's just how it works now. The closest in modern NFL history we have to something like that Flacco Joe Ravens run is probably the Stafford Rams run. And the thing is, Stafford was a highly variable quarterback, but that roster was real good. Like it was really good. So it's not really this like that offensive line. I think a lot of people forget because of the state of the offensive line now. That offensive line was fantastic. They had great receivers. Obviously, they got Cooper Kupp. They have Aaron Donald. They got Jalen Rams. Like that's a good team, right? And
Yeah.
Stafford just kind of played up to his ceiling. Whereas, the Giants team, the Ravens teams, those were just like, sure, why not? David Tyree,
Yeah.
why not? I guess. So I don't think that it's possible to hold on to that hope. So I don't think making it to the playoffs is enough for you to like you don't like you need more than a chip at the table, right? Like you need
It,
a little bit more.
if Brandon Powell makes a helmet catch and maybe,
I'll eat
we
the
get a couple
words.
of double
Yeah.
doinks and
Yeah.
whatever. I mean, maybe Kevin O'Connell is just like a sorcerer and like, bad things just happen to the other teams and that, they just keep making comebacks and everything else. Like I said at the beginning of this, I mean, I know Kirk Cousins is growing the Hulk Hogan handlebar mustache to try and like channel that interface, but I don't know. I mean, and like, I, we'll go back to the beginning of the show when we were talking a little bit about Kirk Cousins and stuff. I don't hate Kirk. In a lot of ways, he's a lot like Madden 24, where like you play it a little bit, you're like, this is fine. But I mean, you also know, hey, like NCAA 14 is better. I'm gonna go rebuild like Hawaii or something. Like, or NFL 2K's dynasty mode. I feel that way about this team. Like, I don't hate their chances going into the season. But when it comes to Philadelphia or San Francisco or any of the other mega powers of the NFL, I don't think they're quite there yet. And it's going to take a process to do that. Can they do that by being just 9-8 every year and then all of a sudden finding their savior in the draft and going up and trading for them? I don't know. Can they do it with Kirk Cousins? I don't know. Like, his play is one of the most interesting storylines this year, because is he going to be more comfortable in Kevin O'Connell's offense in year 2 and eliminate some of those lulls that we saw last year where, they would go out on the opening drive, shoot right down the field, and put 7 points on the board. And then Ryan Wright became an absolute star, just punt, 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 punt. Oh shit, we're down 10. And then, Kirk O'Chain, from the back, and throws a couple of touchdowns late. Like, I don't think that's a sustainable formula for success, but that's why they play the games, I guess. Not to use the cliche, but that's kind of the theme of the Vikings going into the year.
Well, I mean that's why you like football, right? Like,
Yeah.
as an egghead, right? As somebody who goes through all the spreadsheets and figures out what works, what doesn't work, what's sustainable, what's not sustainable, whether or not the Vikings need to make changes after a winning season. Like, I do all of that, right? And it's important for me to report on what I think is the truth about the team. You play the games because the unexpected happens, right? It's not, you don't like stack up everyone's Madden ratings and decide who wins based off of the final team total score, right? You figured out by play on the field, right? And it's because those unexpected things happen that make it such an exciting sport. And it is interesting because Cousins wasn't known for making the unexpected happen in really positive ways, right? In a Vikings uniform, for the longest time, actually, I think even before, might have been 21. In a Vikings uniform, he'd only had like one like significant fourth quarter comeback, and it was against like the Broncos, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was just like, oh boy, oh, this is rough. Like,
And
we're
then
not
he
seeing
had 3 or 4
comebacks.
in like 21. Yeah. Because
Yeah,
he had
and
the Osborne touchdown, and then the Lions one too. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. But yes,
right,
go on.
and that
Sorry.
one, the Vikings were in the most close games in NFL history, and
Yeah.
so like he had so many opportunities to have a fourth quarter comeback that just by chance he got some. And
Yeah.
then last year it was all of those, right? So maybe it's a growing skill. I don't know. Personally, I don't think it tends to be. The skills that are exciting that Cousins seemingly has developed are, an increasing willingness to improvise and be creative about what he does in the pocket, extend plays when he needs to, or go off of his reads when it makes sense to. Something that he's just not hardwired to do. It's something he's never done. And it's interesting because in the past, when he has engineered like these really important drives, even I think a fourth quarter comeback in 2021, there's this remarkable throw, and I wish I remember who it was against, this remarkable throw to Adam Thielen at the sideline. And after the game, we were like, man,
Packers.
that might have been it. Yeah, I think it was
Yes.
that. After the game, we were like, holy crap, we've never seen you do that. That was such like a and it worked. What's going on there? And he's like, yeah, I
Yeah.
shouldn't have thrown that. And you're like, yeah, you should have. What are you talking about? And
It
he's
won
like,
you the
yeah,
game.
yeah, I'm never doing that again. And you're like, bud. Right. It's just like, and so that's just not who he is. Right. And so for him to, be willing to take those chances, to understand that at the end of the game, when you're losing, an incompletion and an interception are just not that far apart in terms of the final. Like, you got to throw these big plays. So that skill seemingly is developing. It overrepresented itself in the 11-0 record they had in the regular season in close games. And I believe it was 8 fourth quarter comebacks, something crazy like that.
Yes, it was 8. Yep.
Okay, great. That itself, that statistic is unsustainable, but the skill to be able to generate, fourth quarter comebacks comes from a willingness to understand that you need to adjust your play style to situations, something you'd never done before. It's something that Aaron Rodgers actually had a lot of difficulty for most of his career. Like, people understand him now to be this Hail Mary maven, to be really good at fourth quarter comebacks. He was so bad at fourth quarter comebacks for the longest time. And I think because he was just afraid to throw an interception. He was playing football like the way he normally does. And you don't notice it because he played at such a high level that him playing normal football was like pretty good. But like, he had a 0-37 record against winning teams when down in the fourth quarter, which some of that's the Packers defense, right? Like, that's, but he threw caution to the wind, and he became a much riskier style of quarterback in that specific situation. And he engineered some of the greatest comebacks, much to the chagrin of Vikings fans, some of the greatest comebacks we've ever seen, including like these Hail Marys against the Ravens and the Lions that are just iconic. And that doesn't happen in a previous version. So you can develop this skill, right? And maybe Cousins has done that, but other elements of his play got worse last year. So if he can retain the elements of play that, his consistency was off, his accuracy just wasn't as where it was usually, rhythm and timing where it was usually. If you can retain that, grab that from previous seasons essentially, and retain the ability to improvise and create, you can be a really great quarterback. I'm not going to hold my breath, but like the tools are there, and so you can do something with it.
So let's wrap things up. What is going on at the Wide Left Substack?
Yeah, so the wide left Substack, so I was let go by my previous employer, and I juggled a couple of offers actually. So I was like, should I sign full time here? Should I do freelance here? And I talked to a couple of people at Substacks, people like Brandon Thorne, people like Matthew Collar, who runs the Purple Insider Substack, and figured I might give it a chance because it seems like I've developed a little bit of a brand of having a distinctive writing style that people want to follow, and I've been overwhelmed with the amount of support people have given me. The idea behind it is that I don't post every single day necessarily, but I do deep dives, like 3,000 words on a 53-man roster. I
Yeah.
do deep dives that really, you try to get people's money's worth on the Vikings, on the NFL at large, any other issues that kind of struck my fancy. At some point, I'm going to write about, larger maybe social movements and politics, mostly as they relate to the NFL or sports, but sometimes kind of outside of it if it feels important enough to me. But it allows me to kind of write about what I want to write about in ways that, in a lot of other situations, it's just not appropriate, right? Like I think for a lot of companies, if you're writing 800-word bits of news, which that's a skill, it's very difficult to be consistent about it and to hit your word count and to hit the SEO at the top and to hit all the important notes and be information dense. That's a skill. It's not one that I have, and it's one that's really important at a lot of companies, right? That write about football and write about sports. And this one allows me to kind of do kind of the nuanced deep dive stuff that doesn't, search highly and rank stuff. So that's it doesn't do highly ranked in searches. So that's the goal of the Substack, is to write about whatever I want to write about, which is mostly going to be the Vikings, mostly going to be football. Sometimes it won't be. And the only real promise is I'm going to make sure that I think about everything that I write. And so far, I've gotten a lot of really positive response to it.
So that's awesome. And, just so people can keep up with your work, maybe check out the Wide Left Substack. Where could people follow you on, I guess, the website formerly known as Twitter?
Yeah, so that's at Arif Hasan NFL, ARIF HASAN NFL. That's what I am on X/Twitter. On Blue Sky, I'm arif.bsky.social. On Threads, I'm Arif M. Hasan. It's who knows with the
On
who's
Wolf,
doing what now.
you know,
Yeah, right. On
just go and get,
Mastodon. Yeah, right. Like I don't know, right. Um, but
yes.
yeah, but you can find that at wideleftpost.substack.com. That's got all of my writing. And anytime, so I am a freelancer still too. Anytime I write something somewhere else, I will also post it to the Substack as a link. Not like I'm not gonna, undercut whoever I'm writing for by posting the full article, but I'm gonna link and summarize a little bit of my work and let people know. So even if you just get the email newsletter, you'll always have access to the kind of work I produce when I produce it.
That is awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us, Arif, about the Vikings roster. But that is all the time we have for the Viking Age today. We do this every Monday and Thursday right here on the Viking Age YouTube channel. We're also in podcast form on Apple and Spotify the very next day. But however you consume us, don't forget to rate, comment, like, and subscribe so you never miss a new episode. For Arif Hasan, I'm Chris Schad, and we will talk to you next time on the Viking Age podcast.